Hello everyone and welcome to tonight's Co-op Party Zoom. This evening we're discussing alternative ways of measuring economic success, moving away from the traditional narrow view of success viewed in terms of GDP to one of measuring health and well-being of people and the things they hold dear. I'm Karen Wilkie, I'm the Co-op Party's Deputy General Secretary, and as someone who's long held an interest in measuring what matters, I'm really delighted to be chairing tonight's Zoom. You'll hear more tonight about the Happy Planet Index and how this is measured, as well as how a wellbeing budget, which countries such as New Zealand are already implementing, might look. First, a couple of bits of housekeeping, and I know some of you will have heard this before, so bear with me. You will be muted. Izzy will unmute you if it's your turn to speak, so please stay muted for the benefit of everyone else being able to hear. This is being recorded, so it can be made available on our YouTube channel for those who aren't able to join us live tonight. And if you've missed any of our previous sessions, I do urge you to go to the YouTube channel to have a look at them. But that means if you don't want to be seen, please turn off your video. This call is being live captioned, so if you want to view subtitles, press the CC button at the bottom of your screen. You can put questions in the chat or you can raise your virtual hand. And just to re-emphasise, the Co-op Party believes that our co-op values should be reflected in our actions as well as our policies. We want all of our members and our event participants to feel safe and welcome and respected in our party. Please ensure that you abide by this when making your contributions today, and I do look forward to hearing from them. We're very pleased to be joined this evening by Nick Marks, who will be speaking more on the nature of the Happy Planet Index, its role and how it's calculated, and then from Daniel Button of the New Economics Foundation on why government policy should be based on a wider range of outcomes leading to a wellbeing budget. Nick can only be with us for a short time, so we're going to hear from him first, and we will have time, I hope, for a short Q&A, and then we'll move on to hearing from Daniel. We're delighted to have Nick joining us this evening. Nick's an applied statistician and a psychotherapist, well known for his public speaking and TED Talks. His research has looked at the impact of society's modern lifestyles and well-being on the environmental cost, leading to the publication of the Happy Planet Index. Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much. I have got some slides, so because I use data, so it probably will help to see things. So I'm just going to stand up, helps me speak. So I'm Nick, nice to meet you all. I am a statistician by trade, so I use a lot of numbers and data. And I used to work at the New Economics Foundation. In fact, I founded their work on well-being there in 2001. So the theme of tonight was the International Day of Happiness, and that was last Saturday, actually, the 20th of March, and it coincided, well, the World Happiness Report was launched then as well. So it's only literally just been launched last Saturday, so I've had a look at the data, but I don't know it in depth. But the headlines are, if you look at these nations on the screen, then this is a rank order of how nations have been doing on happiness in 2020. And you can basically see that Scandinavian countries particularly are doing well. And that's very typically what happens with wellbeing data. The UK is their 18th in the world. It was 13th for the last 3 or 4 years. So we've seen a fall in our happiness scores over that time. The data is collected particularly by Gallup. It's a survey in every country, representative sample. It is the state of the art of well-being measuring globally. Not necessarily within countries, but between countries is the best thing. And what we tend to find is that things like, where's my slide gone? Things like trust and social safety nets really matter when we're looking at the difference between countries. So the reason that Scandinavia does very well is because they're poor. The people at the lower end of the income spectrum are less unhappy than in a country like UK, where we've got more income inequality, we've got slightly lower levels of trust. So that's one of the big drivers, is income inequality around the differences between nations. Obviously, GDP matters, other things do as well. Sorry, just we can also look within the UK. This is data from the World Happiness Report within the UK, and it's looking from, as you can see on the anxiety slide, there's a scale. So I've just been cutting and pasting these in the last hour, but Q9, so the end of 2019 through to 2020, you can see a general rise in anxiety. It's split by age groups here. So you can see that the sort of gold one is older population, the green is middle-aged, and the dotted is the younger. The dotted blue is younger. And you can see on the left, the life satisfaction is typically a measure of happiness. It's a question where you ask, how satisfied are you with your life overall? You can see everybody has dropped over that period, older people, younger people, and middle-aged people. So we've seen quite a hit in the UK. There was another graph I saw which was showing that actually for the first time, we're seeing a real squeeze actually on younger people's well-being during COVID. And I think that's something for us to think about as we try and rebuild afterwards. So we can also think about what's going to be the impact on people's mental health and well-being over time. So this is again taken from the report, where basically they're saying that the first curve is saying that there was an immediate response of fear and anxiety to a year ago when we were all thinking about lockdown. Then there was an intermediate sort of response, which was like, how have we responded to the pandemic restrictions that we've had? Then there are people that haven't got access to mental health support. You could draw this for domestic violence, other issues that have been really getting worse during lockdown, but there's insufficient support for that. And then there's the long-term consequences. And that I'm sure Daniel's going to be talking about too, which is like, we think about well-being budgets, we're thinking about how do we rebuild an economy which actually creates well-being, not just economic growth. And there's lots of hints about things that we need to think about. So this is a very messy graph, but basically what it's saying here is this line here is saying that temporary contracts are really bad for people's well-being and happiness. If you've got a short-term temporary contract or a 0 hours contract, then you're likely to be less happy. And if you look to the one on the right, these are 4 income quartiles. So these are the poorest people, is that the negative impact of being on a short-term fixed contract is worse for poor people. So in other words, if you've already got income insecurity and on top of that, you've got an insecure contract of work, that's a double whammy for you. So again, as we think to rebuild, we particularly think of the impact on younger people who've tended to work, who unemployment has hit more, and are having problems. I think that the way we think about their contracts is going to be important for anything that goes on. This is about working hours. It's actually relatively old data, but basically saying that people are happier if they work less than 40 hours a week than if they work more than 40 hours a week. So all the shenanigans I'm going on in Goldman Sachs at the moment, if you've read that in the newspaper about young people complaining about 80-hour weeks, which is way off to the right and absolutely crazy, the really negative impact on their relationships because they can't sustain them. You know, that is happening in poor parts of the economy all the time. That basically when work squeezes out other life, that is bad for us. That's why when I was at NEF, we produced things like the 5 Ways to Happiness and Wellbeing. These were basically for the Government Office of Foresight in 2008, which were activities that individuals can do, which is that to improve their own happiness and wellbeing. So Connect is about relationships. Being active is there's lots of data about physical activity is important for happiness and wellbeing. It's the quickest way out of a bad mood, going for a walk. Taking notice, which is about being present in the present, noticing what's going on around you is important. Learning, and particularly giving. Generosity has been is a huge protector for happiness and well-being. If you are generous, then you feel better. We've seen so much of that outpouring in COVID, of people supporting each other, and that actually even when people have felt depleted themselves, they've been giving to others, and it's been one of the sort of extraordinary things with it. When I was at NEF, we did things like a wellbeing manifesto where we started trying to outline what were the sort of things that governments could do. So political parties such as yourselves could do. And I'm sure Daniel will build on all of that. And there are other people like the Legatum Institute who've been doing stuff on wellbeing and policy, and I look forward to thinking about how NEF will reapproach this as they come to it. But just in this Legatum, there's things like that about addressing loneliness. This is all pre-COVID, but they do talk about, more well-being at work, reducing unemployment. But they talk about promoting economic growth. And I'm totally not against economic growth, but I am against some of the negative consequences that we find in high materially intensive economies like the UK. And that's why we created the Happy Planet Index. The Happy Planet Index is saying that instead of thinking in GDP per capita as our way of measuring nations' sort of welfare, we need to have a new measure. And what we do with the Happy Planet Index is that we say that it's about people's experience of life, their experience well-being, which is like the World Happiness Report. The life expectancy, i.e., all things being equal, a full life is better than a short life. But we divide that by ecological footprint. And what that means is we're saying that we've actually got to be efficient in terms of environmental impact in how we deliver good lives for people. So our catchphrase became good lives that don't cost the earth as being the idea about what we should be promoting. And the best way to really show that is graphically. So this is a graph of 151 nations around the world. There are all the dots. On this axis is ecological footprint, where more is worse, by i.e. putting more pressure on the planet. Going upwards is GDP per capita, the traditional measure of a nation's welfare. And what you see is it's basically a straight line. And what it appears like, and this is what's so depressing about it, is that in order to be sustainable, it feels like you've got to be poor. And that's really not a measure that's going to be very easy for any politicians. But if instead you actually, instead of putting GDP per capita here, you put well-being, then basically the nations of the world spread out more. So basically you've got countries around here clustered who've got relatively low levels of well-being, but low levels of ecological footprint, typically sub-Saharan Africa. You've got nations strung out here, which have relatively good levels of well-being, internationally at least, but high levels of ecological footprint, typically Western countries and a few Middle Eastern countries where they've got very high footprints. And then you've got nations which are relatively interesting here, where they've got relatively modest levels of ecological footprint and relatively good levels of well-being. They tend to be Latin American. So for example, this is Costa Rica here. And really the aim for the Happy Planet Index is to move nations to the top left of this graph, to the green, and say that's where good lives don't cost the earth. And that's where we should be in 30, 40, 50 years time as we try and reverse climate change and we try and maintain and improve levels of human well-being globally. It does mean there's going to be different policies for different areas of the world. So rich countries need to dematerialize, poor countries need to grow well-being and develop whilst maintaining levels of ecological footprint. And that is in a sort of nutshell what the Happy Planet Index is trying to do. What I do now is about measuring and improving employee happiness since I've left NEF. And we can create interesting data with that. We ask this question repeatedly of employees and our clients. We're basically trying to make better places for people to work in. We ask them every week, how was your week? How have you felt at work this week? And we use that data internally in organizations to make better cultures, better teams, all that sort of stuff. But you can gather our data all together and make graphs of what's happening in the UK at work. So this is a graph showing 2019, where we're measuring weekly experience. Okay, you can see things like typical holiday peaks, the summer and Christmas. So it's making sense, this graph. It's the first year I've got complete data for this. But if you overlay 2020, which is not a typical year, you get a very different graph. And you get this huge crash a year ago where everyone, obviously was really anxious and nervous about the whole lives, which of course impacts their work. And we can see that the average for 2020 was a lot lower than 2019. We can also see this very interesting phase. This is with our clients. So they are people looking at wellbeing data, happiness data every week, but basically they displayed resilience as they climbed back out of it. And for me, that is what a wellbeing economy will be about, is it's resilience. We're all going to have setbacks, personal, we're going to have setbacks in our organizations. Very occasionally we have a global setback like a pandemic. but that is basically where it's going. So just to finish, if you want to know, want to look in work, you can look at how happy you are at work. We've created something which is a free tool for people to do that. It's called friday1.com. You can go there. It's a 5-minute test. It will give you a report. It's fun. And that's me. Nick Mark says, if you've got any questions, that's my email, nick@fridaypulse.com. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you very much. If you have got time for a couple of questions,
Sure.
can we start with Caroline? If you're there, Caroline, a question on universal basic income.
Hi, I am here. Yeah, I think I'm working on a universal basic income. I'm a disabled person. I've got a couple of degrees and always worked and really enjoyed work, but I'm now really distanced from the workplace. Conventional work doesn't fit in with chronic illness and disability. But there's a lot of people who don't work for an awful lot of reasons. And this may be caring responsibilities. A lot of this falls on women, as you're probably aware. And there can be an awful lot of dissatisfaction, stroke unhappiness involved in that. And when we're confronted with this happiness thing, like the work that you've done, a lot of it is linked to actually being in work. And I feel a lot of people who support a UBI feel that a lot more happiness could be released if we take away the insecurity of insecure work, insecure financial incomes, and we have this universal basic income that just reassures you that you're not going to starve, you don't need to turn the heating off, that you have enough money to go for job interviews, and you have a decent quality of life, although it would be not as expansive as normally as it would be if you were earning. So I wondered what your feelings were about a universal basic income that actually was adequate enough to cover the basic needs of every individual.
I'm a big supporter of it, have been for a long time, and I think that you're right. There's lots of benefits from work. So one of them is obviously income security, which a universal basic income could deal with. There are other things that work is good for, but there can be, which is about a sense of belonging, a sense of connection with other people. So when people are made unemployed, we see a massive hit on their well-being. Only about a quarter of that is about loss of income. It's a lot about loss of structure of life, meaning, purpose, and people's relationship with others. And I think that the recent data actually showing that even just 1 day a week of volunteering or paid work is really good for our well-being. So the problem really has been when people have got nothing there. So got no income security and no contact with other people is appalling. So basic income, I think, can deal with the financial security. And I think we do need to have, support community interactions that can help replace some of the structure that work gives people's lives. So I totally agree with you. And I think we can even go a bit further than that.
Two questions that I'll tie together, and I'll try and make questions, hopefully, if people could be a little bit briefly. One is, do you think over the last year during COVID, the public appetite is much greater for policy change in favour of these ideas? And sort of tied to that is a question from John Morris, if John Morris is there, on how do we embed sustainable policy change? John, are you there?
If I take that first question, then Izzy,
Yeah.
I haven't been looking in detail at poll data on what people will support. It rather worries me how much I think some people seem to support strong government at the moment, and so the crackdown on protests and things like that, I think troubles me. So I don't know in detail. I do think the mental health has gone up everyone's agenda. I don't think anyone's coming out of this pandemic unchanged. I think we've all reflected on our lives and what we're doing. So I think we're going to see a seismic shift and I don't quite know what way it's going to go, because I don't understand how but that's I do think things are going to be very changed, but I'm not quite sure how, which isn't very helpful.
I don't think John's here, but
yes,
I think he's. Oh, sorry, John.
Yeah.
You are there. Sorry.
Right. Yes, I mean, I've been involved in lots of discussions with policymakers who it's not hard to persuade them that they shouldn't be using GDP as the key indicator, that they should be looking more widely. They don't tend to change their actions, though, but still carry on decisions as if GDP was the only thing that mattered. Similarly, I think there's an issue with the general public who tend to see economics as some sort of glorious science that is too difficult for them to understand, when in reality, much of economics is a sort of a matter of simple choices between different competing issues, and actually is made complex rather than it is actually complex. But how do you get politicians, policymakers to change, and how do you get people to change their perceptions?
I think in some ways we have to change the nature of the debate. I mean, that's what I worked at NEF for about 10 years doing. And, I mean, my way is, I'm a statistician, is to get better data. So it was very good when the Office of National Statistics committed to measuring well-being very systematically. And there was a lot of optimism when the coalition government was in power, that actually they were going to do something with that well-being data. But I'm afraid I rather agree with you that the government has, the successive governments since then have actually done very little with this data and very little with the insights. Like, we don't see anything there about, very much about, the idea of 0-hour contracts being bad for things like that, which is a very simple thing to start. Well, not a very simple thing, it's a big policy issue, but it's not really talked about enough. And I think that I would hope that coming out of COVID, we will talk about it more, but it's a huge thing. I mean, economics has been, has become a more and more dominant science. It's extraordinarily adaptive as a science. It absorbs everything going along. Like, a lot of the well-being stuff you'll see is now just put into sort of economic equations, and like people crunch them out. And I think we need a more fundamental change, which is why I like work that NEF did on things like, the shorter working week, things like that. I think we really do need to think about how we create more time for the important jobs in life, which have been highlighted this year, like caring, community work, community support. So, I would probably be, much more radical in thinking about how things get together, but it's a difficult thing to get policymakers to change. I mean, I worked here for 10, 15 years, and in the end, I needed a break because I couldn't get them to agree.
Have you got time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, I'm good to the top of the hour. Yeah. So.
Oh, that would be great. Gary Hewson, if you're there, please, and then we'll go to Lola.
I've got someone called Neil raising his hand. I don't know where that is as well.
I don't know whether we've done Gary's having trouble unmuting. Can we go to Lola? Is Lola there? Lola has a question.
Yes, I'm here. I just want to reiterate what Nick said earlier on, because I'm someone who gets my joy and happiness from actually being a community activist. And I'm running, since the pandemic, I'm running a food bank from my garage, which I call the Garage Collection. And even though I have my own issues, but the joy that I get in seeing people's needs that are, being met. Over the years, I have helped literally about 2,000 people back into volunteering. And I've seen how volunteering has transformed their lives, make them to be much, much better person. The happiness of people, it's dependent on all of us. We all have a role to play in helping each other to be happy. We talked about being community focused because that's one of the things I like about the Co-op Party. Our focus is based on connecting our communities and ensuring that there's equal distribution of wealth. That equal distribution of wealth is not just based on money. It's also based on what you and I can do to make each other's lives better. And I'm so happy that we're talking about this today. And I also felt that when we leave here today, individually, we need to go and think about how we can make our community to be a much happier place to be for all. Thank you. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you, Lola. I think that was a sort of contribution rather than a question. So if Nick's got a minute left, we'll quickly go to Neil. Neil Gibb.
I've got a comment on that, which is basically that all of happiness research supports you, that our contribution is massively important for our own happiness. And in fact, that goes right back to ancient Greece, where they used to talk about pleasure and meaning as being the two important things. And actually, those two things, I think of pleasure is about what comes towards us, it nourishes us, but meaning and contribution is what we give back. And I think as humans, we need to do both of those things. And it's just such a richer life if we're in service of others. That's my experience. If we're too selfish, I think we get depleted. If we, yeah, so it's those things. Sorry, next question.
Yeah, hi, Neil here. Thanks, Nick. I really enjoyed that. And I was just thinking, yeah, you talk about collecting data, but then obviously the other thing is the interpretation of the data.
Yeah.
And you gave one example when you looked at sort of the gig economy. Now, I've got a few friends, one in particular, who are freelance computer programmers. Mm-hmm. And they're very happy people, and they mm-hmm. basically operate in the gig economy. But yeah. The difference is what they're doing is highly in demand, very, very interesting. And they, you know, and they love the flexibility of being a freelancer. They're being offered full-time jobs and they don't want. So it struck me that it's not actually the short time, it's not the gig economy that's a problem. It's the idea of, you know, what the future is going to look like that makes a difference. I'm assuming in a lot of 0 hours contracts, it's not enjoyable. There's no security and it's not great work. Where my friend is like, oh, the future's kind of bright, you know. So I'm wondering about the qualitative research that's required here, because happiness is a very interpretive thing. If I ask one person, are you happy? They say yes. I ask another person, they say happy, I'm yes. It's for completely different reasons. So I just wondered how we might, you know, find out the qualitative data rather than just the quantitative data.
I'm not a qualitative data person, but the quant data supports what you say too, which is that, you know, if you've got more personal confidence, you can deal with the insecurities of a 0 hours contract much better. Also, if you've actually got some capital or wealth behind you, you're not highly indebted. So debt becomes a really, really corrosive thing to well-being. So for example, I've seen data like from Iceland when they went through the huge crash in 2008. A lot of people became unemployed and most people were okay. The ones that weren't were the ones that were highly indebted. So debt is another, and there's not enough research on the relationship between debt and that. So if your friends haven't got debt, they've got a huge confidence in their own capacity to find another job, then they can deal with it. It's the people that are, it's the people at the lower end of the income spectrum, particularly, who've probably got less, you know, less easily tradable skills that are looking around for jobs on 0 income. It's really, really corrosive to there. And that goes back into the, you know, the universal income, things like that, to help people have dignity in their lives and some sense of security. Because well, actually what will happen is when people have got security, is that they will learn new skills because they can take the risk to. The problem is that people get caught in the bind of having to feed their family every week and looking for the, you know, the lowest paid, easiest work to get on insecure ways. And you just get into a really vicious spiral with that. So there's a huge difference between them. But there is a lot of difference between what people say is happiness. That's one of the joys of happiness research, is there are different reasons of it. But at the end of the day, all of us need to feel nourished, whether that's, you know, mentally, emotionally, you know, we need to, you know, love is like really important. Relationship is really, really important to us. And contribution and meaning is, and it's not that different for other people, for lots of different people, but, you know, clearly circumstances make a vast difference to people.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. We're delighted that you're able to join us. I'm sorry to everyone that I didn't get their question in. We'll have time for questions, I hope, after Daniel's spoken, but Nick has to leave us now. So thank you very much for that. It was fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much indeed. Bye.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome now Daniel Button, who is a senior researcher at the New Economics Foundation, and his work particularly focuses on health and care, particularly on health inequalities and public services and social change. So Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Karen, and hi everyone. It's really nice to be here. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so my name's Daniel Button. I'm a researcher at the New Economics Foundation, or NEF, as most people seem to refer to us. So I don't know how many people have come across NEF before. Just in case you haven't, we're a think tank and a charity, and we have an overall mission to support a transition to a new economy that actually works for people and planet, rather than the people and the planet working for the economy. So I was asked to talk to you today a bit about why we think we need to change the sort of narrative of policy away from economic growth towards well-being. So I'm going to try and do that over the next sort of 10 minutes or so. But I'm going to pay some special attention to the role that a well-being budget could play in making the shift happen. So making that shift away from growth and towards well-being actually happen in reality. Unlike Nick, I've got no slides, so you will have to put up with my face for 10 minutes. Sorry about that. Great. So at the moment, we tend to give GDP and a small sort of narrow list of additional indicators, you know, an enormous amount of attention, so much so that the success of our economy and the success of our governments sort of judged by small fluctuations in this GDP figure every quarter. But I think there are a number of reasons why the predominance of GDP as the measure of success like that is particularly problematic. So first off, because focusing just on GDP like that can mask what's really going on under the hood. So in recent years, we've seen GDP go up while wages have remained stagnant for a significant period of time. Housing remains unaffordable for many people. And life expectancy has actually started to stall for the first time in a century and even decline in some spaces. And all the while, you know, the planet heats up. So if we only looked at GDP, we wouldn't know any of those things were happening. There's lots going on under the hood, and just focusing on GDP sort of disguises some of those patterns underneath. Secondly, GDP leaves out a lot of what we have reason to value as a society. And it says nothing about the direction of growth and whether that direction is desirable or not. So GDP figures count things like farming, which we do have reason to value, alongside things that we perhaps don't, like, you know, the tobacco and fossil fuel markets. And it misses out lots of important things that many of us do care about. So things like childcare and volunteering and community activism, which we've already heard about today. And the third thing that GDP misses out is the distribution of growth. So we know that the UK is right at the top of the league table of regionally unequal countries. So most of the sort of increases in economic activity that we see in that increasing GDP figure accrue in London and the southeast, and into the hands of too few people. And that's sort of disguised by looking at aggregate GDP figures. Now, I do think this can sometimes all come across as a bit of a sort of technocratic debate. And some people, I think that it doesn't have much real world relevance. But how we measure things and judge success, I think, really does matter. It matters because what we measure shapes the sort of policy decisions that governments take. So governments are currently guided by GDP as a yardstick, whether that's through the Treasury and their cost-benefit analysis or media scrutiny. And that sort of shackles policymakers to chasing growth, which can lead to bad decisions. I also think the other reason why it matters is that our current approach can shut out democracy. So fixing on growth alone as the sort of only goal leaves little room for discussion about what we do value and what as a society we want to pursue. So that gets cut off, and politics too frequently just becomes about how to best manage growth rather than thinking about what we want to achieve as an economy or as a society. So instead of treating growth as a sort of proxy for well-being, or just assuming that more growth will result in greater well-being, I think we should be measuring a much wider range of outcomes that do a better job of capturing well-being. It's worth noting, I think, that by well-being, I'm not just talking about happiness or how we feel subjectively. I do think this is a part of it and a really important part of it. What I'm talking about more is sort of quality of life more broadly, which goes beyond just subjective outcomes. And I think we should be measuring a sort of a wider sort of dashboard, I guess, of objective outcomes as well. And we should be judging the economy and our society by things like income and employment and housing and environmental quality as well. I think it's also worth noting that pursuing this wider range of outcomes doesn't preclude us from pursuing growth. So when we do look at a wider range of outcomes to judge the success of our economy, growth would just become one of the sorts of means that we can use to achieve these things. And the onus will be on demonstrating the best course of action rather than just assuming growth will get us there. Now, I think all of the arguments I've made so far are pretty familiar by now. They've been well made in the past by many, many people. And I think the response to them now has turned more or less from a sort of skepticism about the need to move beyond growth to sort of questions about what should replace GDP. So now we're thinking a lot about sort of technical questions about what well-being is and how we can measure and track it. And there's been lots and lots of work trying to address these questions over the last decade. So there's an enormous amount of work exploring the different alternative outcomes and indicators that we could use to track well-being rather than growth. And I think all of the different indicators that people have come out with have a lot in common. And while we can sort of argue about which is best and about the details about how exactly they should be applied, I don't think these sort of technical questions are the barriers anymore. I really do think we know enough about the alternatives and the different types of measurement that we need. And I think now what we need to do is actually bridge the gap between measurement and policy and begin to actually use these tools in practice. So I think it was mentioned earlier that the ONS already measure well-being, but it's not yet been put into practice. So now's the time to do that. And this is where I think the idea of well-being budgets come in. So well-being budgets and the idea of well-being budgets has been gathering quite a lot of steam recently, not least because New Zealand broke new ground, I think it was actually a year or two now, by skewing GDP in favour of well-being indicators when setting their national budget and deciding how they're going to spend their money. So bids to the Treasury for money in New Zealand now not only need a cost-benefit analysis, but they also have to have an assessment of well-being impact. And decisions about spending have been made based on a project's or policy's sort of well-being contribution. So to do that, the government developed this well-being framework. So it's a framework of lots of different outcomes that sort of contribute to our well-being. And when they come to set in a budget, they pick a number of priority outcomes. And they've used that as the basis for the budget. In Iceland, they've done something similar. So they've been following New Zealand and they've developed their own well-being framework. They've been setting priority outcomes that they want to improve from that framework. And they've got plans for a well-being budget to follow. So they're thinking about how they can use that well-being framework to spend money. And then closer to home, Wales and Scotland already have their own national well-being frameworks. And I think they've also got plans to conduct their own well-being budgets as well. So to use that framework to think about how they spend money. I think well-being budgets in the UK, if they were implemented, would be a really good way to bridge the gap between measurement and policy. So to move from thinking about how we measure well-being to actually using that measurement to direct policy. Budgets are what Catherine Drebeck from the Wellbeing Alliance calls moral statements with money attached. You know, they have a lot of power to set government direction beyond just spending alone. I think it's a really good way to sort of indicate your intention to base policy on a wider set of priorities, because you're putting your money where your mouth is, essentially. And if it's done in the way that they've done it in New Zealand, where the government have to publicly state what their priorities are, I think this would make government decisions a lot more transparent. And I also think it would open up the space for more democracy. You know, we could experiment with ways of involving citizens in that process of picking priorities that we need to improve people's well-being. I also think there are really good reasons to be pursuing this sort of well-being budget process now. And firstly, this is because COVID has opened up, I think, the political opportunity to do something. So the pandemic, you know, has really forced us to reassess what we value as a society, and has, you know, exposed the pitfalls of our current model of focusing on these sort of narrow economic goals, which left us with underfunded public services, undervalued key workers, and really wide inequalities, which all, you know, left us exposed to the pandemic. And a wellbeing budget would enable us to open up that conversation about how we build back better from coronavirus and what that actually means, and then how we direct society's resources towards that accordingly. I also think we should be pursuing this wellbeing budget idea now, because we have a government and a public that, for the moment at least, is willing to spend money. But we need to make sure that that money is going towards the right things. And at the moment, I don't think that's the case. So at the budget in March, the government announced lots of new money for sort of flashy physical infrastructure projects, but they cut day-to-day spending on a number of essential services. So while the government is spending, it's not spending in the right direction. So they're not spending in a way that's going to improve well-being, in my view. And I think the wellbeing budgets idea would be a really good tool to show why the direction of spending is sort of all wrong. So one of the things we're going to be doing at NEF is modelling an indicative wellbeing budget, where we sort of pick a few wellbeing outcomes, look at how the government's proposals fare when assessed using these outcomes, and then we look at how they could have, then we're going to look at how they could have invested differently to meet them if they were truly trying to direct spending towards increasing wellbeing outcomes. So that's it from me. I'm going to leave it there. I think I might have gone over my time.
No, that was fabulous. Thank you very much. We have got some questions coming in, but I'll start off with one that we've had, and that's about Wales, which you've slightly referred to there as one of the countries that is making a movement on this, and has legislated with the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act to ensure that all public policy is seen through the wellbeing goals lens. We question on a sustainable change, you know, change that sticks. So in Wales, there's the Future Generations Commissioner who holds everyone to account. Is that what is going to be needed in other places? You know, someone who sort of has this overview and holds all organisations to account for making sure that this happens, rather than it just being a short-term policy change?
Yeah, I think that's something that's really important to be thinking about. So how, you know, if a government does bring in a wellbeing budget, how it sticks beyond that government. And a body or an individual, I think, holding the government to account would be a really good way to do that, sort of akin to the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales. Yeah, it does seem like Wales is really leading the way here. And on a UK-wide basis, we could have something similar to the Office for Budget Responsibility, which looks at the impact of government proposals on wellbeing, and that could sit within the Treasury, although I guess we need to really change the culture of the Treasury if that was to be successful, or it could be elsewhere. Yeah.
Great, thank you. We've got a question from Valerie, which is about ensuring that everybody benefits, including people with protected characteristics. Are you there, Valerie? can't see Valerie here. I'll just go to somebody else first. I can't see any other hands. I'll take one of the questions that we've had in earlier, and that was about procurement and how much of an impact or how important is procurement in public organisations.
I think this wider set of outcomes should be sort of key and core to government procurement processes. So yeah, we should be looking at wellbeing outcomes when we're sort of commissioning services, public services, for instance, and not just looking at sort of economic gains, but looking at wider social value. And there's lots of examples of local government and regional government that have been much more effective with that.
That's great. I'm just told that Valerie has gone, so I've missed her question. So I'm looking for some of the questions while people put their hands up. I'm looking for some of the questions that we've had sent in earlier on by email, ones that we haven't had before. Saxon had a fabulous question earlier, if Saxon is still here.
Yes, I am. It seems to me that the Co-op Party spends a lot of time trying to encourage cooperatives and working with existing cooperatives like the Cooperative Society. Is there any evidence that people in cooperatives, mutuals and social enterprises are happier and possibly more productive?
I'm not personally very sort of familiar with the evidence base, but I'm fairly sure that would be the case. I think the sort of business model of cooperatives is sort of tacitly based around the idea of well-being, isn't it? These are sort of designed with well-being in mind. I think they're not just about money, but about a much wider range of valuable goals, aren't they? They're about local wealth, they're about social connections, they're about power and control, and we know all of those things are important to our well-being.
Yeah, and I think that relates to another question that we had earlier, which was about, I don't know whether this is one that we should have directed at Nick, because it is about the workplace. I mean, we believe that worker co-ops or mutuals are fairer workplaces. So how do we spread those values of a dignified way of working out to other forms of business? I don't know if you have any views on that one.
That's probably one for Nick rather than me, but yeah, I definitely agree. But I do just think like having a much wider range of goals that we value in society will help spread those values more widely, right? So if we talk about a wider range of things other than just how we increase our economic output as a society, it will help spread the sort of values which cooperatives and different business models thrive in. Yeah,
of course. We're coming up to the end of our time, and unless I've missed them, I can't see any more hands. So that just leaves it for me. Oh, sorry, Martin. Martin, I do see your hand now.
Hello. Yes.
Sorry, I can't see your face. Yes, carry on. Sorry, I can only see your name. I can't see your face.
That's all right. It's actually his wife, Margaret. Never mind. I do have a question. Governments measure success by economic growth, and we need to change that. But how do we change the individual's view that their success is measured by their pay packet and what it can buy, rather than their overall general well-being?
Yeah, this is a tricky question. I think, changing sort of public discourse about what's important and what success is rather difficult. But I do think COVID here has helped. It sounds like a weird thing to say, but yeah, coronavirus has really sort of forced us to reassess what we value as a society and what we value as an individual. And it's really opened up the space for those sorts of conversations, I think.
Thank you. We've got time for one or two last questions if they're quick. Tom, I see your hands up now. Tom Gilbert.
Thanks. Yeah, sorry if I missed this in the original presentation. Is there data on sort of what the level of public awareness and support is out there for wellbeing measures, and if that's changed over the last year as well?
Yeah, there is some data about this, I think. So Positive Money did quite a lot of polling at the start of the pandemic, just after the first lockdown, looking at what people sort of think the priority for the economy and for the government should be, and explicitly asked whether people would prioritise putting health and well-being above economic growth, and that received quite a lot of support. And I think that that had improved since they when they did it before. So the pandemic has sort of increased support for well-being and health above GDP, it seems.
Thank you. Have you got time for one last question? This is from Janvier Palmer. Are you there? It's about balancing the needs of different people.
I mean, the example I would use is that we know that pensions tend to be regularly protected because older people are a stronger voting bloc. I was wondering if there's any risks that well-being and well-being measures would end up being prioritised for stronger voting groups and, you know, that sort of thing as well, and if that's a risk we need to tackle.
Yeah, but I do think the sort of distribution of well-being is key to a well-being budget. I think that's the sort of key part of it. So we wouldn't just look at well-being in the aggregate. It would be really important to distribute it, so we can look at the well-being of different groups, of different income groups, different ethnicities, gender inequalities and well-being. And that would need to be sort of mainstreamed in the process, because if there are inequalities in well-being, then we're not going to be achieving a sort of well-being economy.
Sorry, it's me forgetting to unmute myself. I think we've got time for two questions if they're brief. I'm going to take David Breed and then Jill Robertson, and I think then we're pretty much out of time. David.
Hi there. Taking this forward, how do you see the cooperative party's role in actually sort of moving forward a happiness agenda? Have you got any pointers for that?
I think we need as many people as possible to be calling for a wellbeing budget and putting pressure on the government to implement this, or pressure on the next government to implement this. So it would be really great to see the cooperative party sort of publicly calling for this, and sort of working in a coordinated fashion with other bodies and actors to really push for a wellbeing budget.
Thanks, Stanley. I think that's one for us to take away as much as one for you. Jill.
Hi, can you hear me?
Sorry, Jill, I've muted you. I'll quickly try again. See if.
And I think it's better now. That's fine. Yeah, I just wondered regarding the OBR whether they actually consider the intergenerational happiness when they're doing their budgets, because older people, older women particularly, are having to work a lot longer than they expected to, and therefore a lot of their jobs are places where younger people could take that work. So I wondered if there was ever any consideration of the OBR when they do their budgets, which is almost what Janvier was saying.
At the moment, as far as I'm aware, the OBR don't assess well-being at all, or look at, you know, the generational impacts of different policies on well-being. And that is something we're sort of interested in exploring, so how you could expand the role of institutions like the OBR to assess the wellbeing impacts of different policy decisions on different groups. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Right, just mute Jill. Thank you, Daniel. That was absolutely fabulous. And thank you, everyone, for all your views. Some tough questions there, and quite I think for us to take away and look at in our policy going forward. So thank you, Daniel, for being with us tonight. That was wonderful. Thank you, everyone, once again, for taking part in our Zooms. If anyone you know wasn't able to join us, direct them to our YouTube channel. We'll have that up there along with our others. Please join us again for our Zoom. Thank you, everybody, very much, and good night. Thank you.